in the shining glass tower of the city, where wealth spoke louder than words and power was measured by the size of one's bank account. A millionaire sat in his luxurious office surrounded by men who admired his riches but secretly feared his arrogance. And on that particular afternoon, as the sun painted golden stripes across the polished floor, a quiet figure moved in the background, almost invisible, a cleaner with worn shoes, a faded uniform, and hands rough from endless work. She bent low to wipe the corner of the room, careful not to disturb the expensive furniture or the conversations of the powerful men. And though her presence was humble, it carried a strange weight, as if she belonged to a world far removed from their arrogance, yet had more dignity in her silence than they had in their wealth. But the millionaire, proud of his status and always hungry for entertainment, noticed her movements and felt an impulse, not of kindness, but of cruelty. For to him, the cleaner was nothing more than an object to be mocked, a reminder of how high he stood above the rest. So, with a smirk curling on his lips, he leaned back in his leather chair and called the attention of his companions to the woman quietly working, saying in a tone dripping with mockery, "Shall we give her a little challenge? Let us see if she can do more than scrub floors." And his friends, eager for amusement, chuckled, leaning closer to watch the scene unfold, their laughter bouncing off the glass walls of the office like echoes of vanity. While the cleaner paused for only a moment, her hand stilling on the cloth as she looked up at the man, her eyes calm, her face unreadable, and though she said nothing, her silence carried more meaning than words. For it was not the silence of fear, but the silence of someone who had seen cruelty before and had learned not to waste her energy on anger. And this unsettled the millionaire, even as he continued his charade, pushing forward with the cruel challenge he had invented, a challenge designed to make her stumble, to remind everyone in the room that she was beneath them. And the men laughed louder, already entertained by the idea of her humiliation. But what none of them realized was that beneath the cleaner's quiet exterior lay a depth they could not imagine, a hidden story that would turn their laughter into disbelief. And as the moment stretched, the air in the office seemed to thicken with a tension none of them could name. For though the millionaire believed he controlled the game, it was the cleaner's silence, steady and unshaken, that now held the room in its grip, creating a suspense none of them expected, as if the outcome of this cruel act would be far different than the arrogant man intended. The laughter in the grand office had barely died down when the cleaner, who had been the quiet target of the millionaire's mockery, slowly straightened her back and looked at the man who sat in his polished leather chair, a man who thought his wealth made him untouchable. And instead of shrinking under his gaze, as everyone expected, she spoke in a voice so steady that the walls themselves seemed to listen, her tone neither angry nor timid but calm, measured, and filled with an unshakable confidence that immediately unsettled the atmosphere. She did not protest his cruel words, nor did she beg to be spared the humiliation of his challenge, but instead she simply accepted. And the weight of her acceptance was so strange that the room fell into silence. For her voice carried no trace of fear, no hesitation, no weakness, only a quiet strength that none of the men laughing had prepared themselves to face. And in that instant, the smirks on their faces froze, their amusement crumbling into confusion, because this was not how the story was supposed to unfold. And for the first time, the millionaire himself felt something unusual stir in his chest. Not amusement, not triumph, but unease. The kind of unease that creeps in when a person realizes they have underestimated someone standing before them. For there was something in her composure that made her appear larger than her role, greater than her uniform, as if the faded cloth she wore was a mask hiding a truth that none of them had cared to notice. And though the millionaire leaned back in his chair to maintain his image of control, he could not stop his eyes from narrowing at her steady expression, because it was not the face of a servant bowing to his authority, but the face of someone who carried a secret knowledge, a quiet authority of her own. And the longer she stood there, holding their gaze without trembling, the more the power in the room seemed to shift, an invisible current moving away from the millionaire and toward the woman he had tried to belittle. And though no one dared to admit it aloud, every man present felt it that strange, unspoken truth that perhaps the cleaner was not as ordinary as she appeared, and perhaps her silence all along had been less about submission and more about patience, the patience of someone who knew she did not need to prove herself through words, for she held something far stronger within. And as she accepted his challenge with such certainty, a chill spread through the arrogant heart of the millionaire, a whisper of fear telling him that he might have just begun a game where he no longer held the winning hand. The room that had moments ago echoed with careless laughter now stood in a silence so sharp it felt like the air itself had stopped moving, for the cleaner, the woman whom they had all dismissed as invisible, began to speak, and with every word that left her lips, the grand image the millionaire had built in his mind of her being weak and ordinary began to crumble like dust between his fingers, because what she revealed was not the story of a life spent only sweeping floors and polishing windows, but a history carved out of determination, struggle, and achievement so far beyond anything he had imagined that even his most arrogant friends found themselves leaning forward, unable to believe what they were hearing. She spoke of her younger years, of the endless nights she had studied while the world slept, of the training she had undergone in fields none of them would have dared to attempt, of the knowledge she had gathered, not from books alone but from experiences across places and situations they could not dream of surviving. And with each detail, it was as though she pulled a curtain back from her true self, showing them not the cleaner they had mocked, but a woman who had once stood at heights greater than they could comprehend, a woman who had faced storms of life and conquered them, who had been tested in ways money could never prepare one for. And though her voice was calm and steady, it carried a quiet fire that burned away their arrogance, because in that moment they realized that while they had defined her by her uniform, she had defined herself by her journey, and the contrast was unbearable to their pride. The millionaire, who had begun this as nothing more than a cruel joke, now sat rigid in his chair, his smile long gone, his eyes locked on her as if searching desperately for a flaw in her story. But there was none, for everything she said carried the weight of truth, and it shook him, not because she had risen above his expectations, but because he saw in her something he had never truly earned himself respect, built not on wealth or status, but on resilience and wisdom. And as she spoke on, revealing piece by piece the depth of her life, the room seemed to shrink, the walls closing in around the arrogant men who now wished they had stayed silent, for they had laughed at a person who had walked through fires they could never endure. And now, with every truth she revealed, their laughter was replaced with shame, their arrogance replaced with awe, until at last there was nothing left in the air but stunned silence, heavy and unbreakable, for the cleaner they had thought invisible had become the center of the room, the unshakable truth standing tall before their fallen pride. For the first time in many years, the millionaire felt something that money could not shield him from, an uneasy crack forming in the armor of his pride, a tremor in the walls of superiority he had built around himself. For as he sat there in his grand office, surrounded by polished glass and leather chairs, he could no longer deny the weight of the cleaner's presence. And it was not her uniform or her role that now defined her in his eyes, but the quiet strength she carried, a strength he had mocked, yet now found himself powerless against, because she had revealed a truth that he could not ignore. That respect was never bought with riches or displayed in gold watches and expensive suits, but earned through dignity, resilience, and the unseen battles fought in silence, battles far greater than the petty games of wealth he had always played. And as he stared at her, he felt small, truly small, as though the floor beneath his feet had shifted, leaving him exposed before someone he had dismissed as nothing. And the shame of it burned deeper than he could admit, for the laughter of his friends, which had once fed his ego, now felt like knives turning against him, each chuckle a reminder of his arrogance. And yet, even they were no longer laughing, their smug smiles gone, their eyes darting nervously between him and the cleaner. Because they, too, could feel it, the shift in the room, the realization that they had all played a part in a cruel joke that had now turned into their humiliation. And one by one they shifted uncomfortably in their chairs, their posture betraying their guilt, as if the walls themselves were pressing down on them, demanding an unspoken apology. And still the cleaner stood there, not boasting of her strength, not gloating in victory, but simply existing in the dignity they had tried to strip from her. And her silence was heavier than any speech, because it reminded them all that true power does not scream or demand, it simply stands unshaken. And in that unshakable presence, the millionaire saw his own weakness. For all his wealth, all his pride, all his claims of superiority, he had never earned the kind of respect that this woman commanded without raising her voice. And the thought gnawed at him like a shadow creeping into his heart, forcing him to question whether the life he had built was truly strength at all, or merely an illusion built on the trembling fear of being less than others. And as he glanced at his friends, he saw the same reflection in their eyes, the dawning truth that they had been wrong, deeply wrong. And it was this realization, heavy and unavoidable, that marked the turning point, the moment when arrogance cracked and humanity broke through, leaving behind a silence that carried not laughter, but the weight of lessons they had never wanted to learn. What began as a careless moment of arrogance soon turned into the most important lesson of the millionaire's life. For when the echoes of laughter faded and the room returned to its quiet hum, he found himself staring at the cleaner not as a servant of the building, but as a mirror reflecting back all the flaws he had long ignored in himself. And in that mirror he saw how shallow his pride had been, how fragile the walls of superiority he had built with wealth truly were. Because for all his money and titles, he had never carried the quiet dignity she displayed, and that truth unsettled him in ways no financial loss ever could. And as the image of her calm face lingered in his mind, he felt something shift inside, a realization that the value of a person was not measured by fine clothes or expensive watches, but by the strength that came from resilience, from battles fought in silence, from lessons earned through hardship. And the more he thought about it, the more he understood how dangerous it was to judge someone by appearances. For he had nearly trapped himself in the blindness of arrogance, believing himself untouchable while dismissing those around him as less. And yet it was the one he had mocked who carried the strength he lacked, a truth so sharp it pierced the core of his pride. And as he replayed the incident in his mind, he knew it would never leave him, because it was no longer just an embarrassing moment. It was a lesson etched into his soul, one that whispered every time he tried to look down on another, reminding him that respect was not a gift to be handed out by the wealthy, but a right every person deserved, and that true greatness did not shine in the glitter of riches, but in the simple act of seeing others with humanity. And as the days turned into weeks, he found himself changed, his voice softer when he spoke to those who served him, his laughter quieter when tempted to mock, his thoughts slower when judgment tried to rise. And though he never admitted it to his friends, he knew deep inside that the cleaner had left him something more valuable than gold, a lesson that had broken the chains of his arrogance and freed him to see the world differently. And that lesson, carried in silence, would follow him for the rest of his life, like an unshakable shadow, an invisible mark of respect earned, not through wealth, but through humility.